Sarah Martinez walked through the crowded airport terminal, her simple black hoodie and jeans making her blend into the sea of travelers. At 34, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that most people missed entirely. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her athletic build was hidden beneath loose-fitting clothes. To anyone watching, she looked like just another passenger heading home after a business trip. The delayed flight announcement echoed through Terminal C, and Sarah found herself settling into an uncomfortable plastic chair near Gate 27. Around her, frustrated passengers complained loudly about the 3-hour delay that would keep them grounded until morning. She pulled out a worn paperback novel and began reading, grateful for the unexpected quiet time. "Excuse me, miss." A sharp voice cut through her concentration. Sarah looked up to see a woman in an expensive business suit standing over her, arms crossed, and wearing an expression of barely contained irritation. Behind the woman stood 2 men in equally expensive attire, both checking their phones with obvious annoyance. "Yes," Sarah replied politely, closing her book and giving the woman her full attention. "We need these seats," the woman said, gesturing dismissively at the row where Sarah sat. "We have an important conference call in 20 minutes, and this is the only area with decent cell reception and power outlets." Sarah glanced around the terminal. While this section was certainly convenient, it was hardly the only option available. Several other seating areas nearby offered similar amenities, and many were completely empty. She looked back at the woman with a patient smile. "I understand your situation, but, as you can see, there are plenty of other seats available. I was here first, and I'd prefer to stay where I am." The woman's face flushed red, and her voice rose several notches. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" "I'm Jennifer Walsh, Senior Vice President of Morrison Financial Group. These gentlemen are executives from our Tokyo office, and we're conducting international business that affects millions of dollars in transactions." One of the men stepped forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, sweetheart, why don't you just move along? Find somewhere else to read your little romance novel. Adults are trying to work here." The small crowd of passengers nearby had begun to take notice of the commotion. Some were openly staring, while others pretended to focus on their phones or laptops while clearly listening to every word. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond to the public humiliation attempt. Sarah remained perfectly calm, her voice steady and respectful. "I appreciate that you have important work to do, but I'm not moving. There are plenty of other suitable areas in this terminal for your call." Jennifer's laugh was sharp and mocking. "Oh, how precious. Let me guess. You're probably some middle management nobody who thinks she's important because she has a corporate credit card for her little business trips." She looked Sarah up and down with obvious disdain. "Honey, some of us actually matter in this world. Some of us have real responsibilities that affect real people." The second executive, a tall man with graying temples, decided to join the verbal assault. "Jennifer's being too kind. Look at this kid. She's probably some intern or assistant pretending to be important. I bet she doesn't make in a year what we spend on lunch meetings." The small audience of passengers was growing larger. A few people had actually moved closer to get a better view of the confrontation, and Sarah could hear whispered comments and speculation about what was happening. The embarrassment was clearly intended to be public and thorough. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her voice still remarkably calm despite the escalating insults. "I understand you're frustrated about the delay, but that doesn't give you the right to be disrespectful. I'm staying in my seat." Jennifer's voice reached a pitch that could be heard across half the terminal. "Disrespectful? You want to talk about disrespectful? You're disrespecting successful business professionals who actually contribute to society. You're probably some minimum wage nobody who's never accomplished anything meaningful in her entire pathetic life." The crowd was fully engaged now, with some passengers taking out their phones to record what had become a full-scale public scene. Airport security was starting to take notice from across the terminal, though they hadn't yet approached the group. "I bet she's never even held a real job," the tall executive added with a cruel laugh. "Probably lives in her parents' basement and thinks a weekend trip to visit her sister counts as business travel. Some people have no concept of what real success looks like." Sarah felt her jaw tighten slightly, but her expression remained neutral. She had dealt with far worse situations than this, in places where the consequences were measured in lives rather than hurt feelings. 3 corporate bullies in an airport terminal were hardly the most challenging opponents she had ever faced. You know what your problem is? Jennifer continued, apparently interpreting Sarah's silence as weakness. You have no respect for your betters. You probably grew up thinking everyone gets a participation trophy, that everyone's opinion matters equally. Well, let me educate you, they don't. Some people are more important than others, and some people deserve more respect than others. The verbal assault continued for several more minutes, with all 3 executives taking turns making increasingly personal and insulting comments about Sarah's appearance, presumed background, and assumed lack of success or importance. They seemed to feed off each other's cruelty, each trying to deliver a more cutting insult than the last. Throughout the entire tirade, Sarah sat quietly, occasionally nodding or saying, "I understand," in response to their demands that she move. Her book remained closed in her lap, and she gave them her full attention with the kind of patience that comes from extensive training in dealing with hostile situations. Finally, Jennifer seemed to run out of steam. She stood there breathing heavily, her face flushed from the exertion of her public tirade. The 2 men flanked her, looking smug and satisfied with their performance. Around them, at least 30 passengers had gathered to watch the show, many still recording with their phones. "So," Jennifer said with a triumphant smile, "now that we've established the pecking order here, are you going to move, or do we need to call security to remove you?" Sarah looked up at the 3 executives calmly, then slowly stood up from her chair. For a moment, Jennifer looked victorious, clearly believing that her public humiliation tactics had worked. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see the defeat of the quiet young woman who had dared to stand up to the important business people. But instead of gathering her belongings to leave, Sarah simply stood there, meeting Jennifer's gaze steadily. When she spoke, her voice carried a new quality, still calm and controlled, but with an undertone of authority that hadn't been there before. "Ma'am, I've listened respectfully to everything you've had to say. You've made assumptions about who I am, what I do for a living, and what I've accomplished in my life.
Listen up!
You've insulted me
This is
personally
it. Move
and
out
professionally,
now!
all because I declined to give up a seat I was occupying legitimately." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Before this goes any further, I think you should know exactly who you're talking to." Something in Sarah's tone caused Jennifer to take a small step backward. The smug expressions on the executives' faces flickered slightly, replaced by the first hint of uncertainty they had shown since the confrontation began. "I am Commander Sarah Martinez," she said clearly, her voice carrying easily across the now silent terminal area. "United States Navy SEALs." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Jennifer's face went from flushed red to pale white in the space of a heartbeat. Both executives took several steps backward, their expressions shifting from smug superiority to shocked disbelief. The crowd of onlookers erupted in surprised murmurs and excited whispers. "I've served 4 combat deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq," Sarah continued, her voice still calm, but now carrying unmistakable authority. "I've led special operations missions that are classified at the highest levels of government. I've been awarded the Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and a Purple Heart for actions taken in defense of this country." Jennifer opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. She looked like someone who had just realized she had been picking a fight with a grizzly bear while assuming it was a house cat. "I've spent the last 15 years of my life serving this nation in ways that most people couldn't imagine and in places that most people couldn't survive. I've made decisions that affected the lives of my teammates, the success of critical missions, and the safety of American citizens." Sarah's eyes never left Jennifer's face. "So when you tell me I've never accomplished anything meaningful, when you tell me I don't matter, when you tell me I've never held a real job, I think you might want to reconsider your position." The terminal area had gone completely silent except for the distant sounds of normal airport operations. Even the background conversations and announcements seemed muted by the weight of what had just been revealed. Passengers were openly staring now, many with expressions of awe and respect. Jennifer finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I had no idea. I'm so sorry. You had no idea because you made assumptions, Sarah replied. You decided who I was based on my appearance and my age, and you treated me accordingly. You thought you could bully someone you perceived as weak or unimportant. She sat back down in her chair and reopened her book. I'm still not moving. The three executives stood there for a long moment, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The crowd of passengers continued to watch, many now smiling at the dramatic reversal of fortune they had just witnessed. A few people could be heard quietly expressing their respect for Sarah's service and their disapproval of how she had been treated. Finally, Jennifer cleared her throat nervously. Commander Martinez, we really do need to make this important call. Sarah looked up from her book with raised eyebrows. And, as I explained earlier, there are many other suitable areas in this terminal for your call. My answer hasn't changed. Without another word, the three executives gathered their belongings and walked away, their earlier arrogance completely deflated. As they retreated, Sarah could hear scattered applause from some of the passengers who had witnessed the confrontation. A few people approached her to express their gratitude for her service and their admiration for how she had handled the situation. An elderly man in a veteran's cap was the first to approach. Commander, thank you for your service. That was beautifully handled. Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time since the confrontation began. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. A young woman with a small child stepped forward next. I'm sorry they treated you that way. My husband is deployed overseas right now, and it makes me so angry when people don't respect what you all sacrifice for us. Your husband's service is just as important as mine, Sarah replied warmly. Please give him my regards when you speak with him. As the crowd gradually dispersed and the terminal returned to know Sarah had barely settled back into her reading when she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. A man in his 50s, wearing a crisp business suit and an expression of barely contained anger, was approaching her seat. Behind him walked Jennifer and her two colleagues, their faces showing a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. Commander Martinez? The older man's voice was formal but carried an undertone of challenge. I'm Richard Morrison, CEO of Morrison Financial Group. I believe you've met my senior vice president, Jennifer Walsh. Sarah looked up from her book, closing it again with practiced patience. Mr. Morrison, how can I help you? I understand there was some sort of misunderstanding earlier, Morrison said, his tone suggesting he believed the fault lay entirely with Sarah. My employees were simply trying to conduct important business, and apparently there was some confusion about seating arrangements. The small crowd that had begun to disperse was now reassembling, sensing that the drama was far from over. Several passengers who had witnessed the original confrontation moved closer, clearly anticipating another confrontation. The atmosphere in the terminal grew tense once again. Sarah studied Morrison's face carefully. Unlike his employees, who now looked thoroughly chastened, the CEO showed no signs of remorse or embarrassment. If anything, he seemed annoyed that his staff had been publicly humiliated by what he clearly still viewed as an insignificant obstacle to their plans. There was no misunderstanding, sir, Sarah replied calmly. Your employees asked me to move from a seat I was occupying legitimately. When I declined, they chose to insult and berate me publicly. The situation escalated because they assumed I was someone they could intimidate. Morrison's jaw tightened slightly. Commander, I'm sure you understand the importance of international business relations. We have clients in Tokyo who are waiting for this call, and, frankly, the success of this deal could mean hundreds of jobs for American workers. Surely someone with your background can appreciate the bigger picture here. It was a clever tactic, Sarah had to admit. Morrison was trying to reframe the situation, making it about patriotism and economic responsibility rather than basic human decency. He was attempting to use her military service against her, suggesting that a true patriot would sacrifice her own comfort for the greater good of American business. Mr. Morrison, Sarah said, standing up to meet him at eye level, are you suggesting that your business call is more important than basic respect between human beings? That your financial interests justify your employees' behavior toward me? I'm suggesting that practical people sometimes need to make practical compromises, Morrison replied, his voice taking on a lecturing tone. Military personnel understand chain of command and the importance of mission accomplishment. Sometimes individual comfort has to be subordinated to larger objectives. The crowd was growing larger again, and Sarah could see airport security personnel positioning themselves nearby, clearly preparing to intervene if the situation escalated further. Several passengers were once again
Listen
recording the
up!
confrontation
We
with
move
their
now,
phones,
execute
and
with precision!
Sarah could hear whispered conversations speculating about what would happen next. "Let me make sure I understand your position," Sarah said, her voice remaining perfectly calm despite the obvious provocation. "You believe that because I'm military personnel, I should automatically defer to your business needs? That my service to this country obligates me to tolerate disrespectful treatment from your employees?" Morrison's confidence seemed to waver slightly, but he pressed forward. "I believe that reasonable people can find reasonable solutions. You're obviously an accomplished individual, Commander, but surely you can appreciate that not everyone has the luxury of government job security. Some of us have to compete in the real world, where results matter more than titles." It was another calculated insult, wrapped in the language of reasonableness. Morrison was suggesting that military service was somehow less demanding or important than corporate success, that Sarah's achievements were merely the result of government protection rather than genuine merit. Jennifer, who had been standing silently behind her boss, finally found her voice. "Richard, maybe we should just find somewhere else." "Nonsense," Morrison cut her off sharply. "This is a matter of principle now. We can't allow ourselves to be intimidated by someone who's obviously more interested in making a scene than in finding a reasonable solution." The irony was stunning. Morrison was accusing Sarah of making a scene, when it was his employees who had created the original disturbance, and he who had escalated it by arriving with his aggressive demands. But Sarah recognized the tactic. Reframe the narrative to make the victim appear to be the aggressor. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said, her patience clearly wearing thin but her voice still controlled, "let me explain something to you about military service, since you seem to have some misconceptions about what it entails." The crowd fell silent again, sensing that they were about to witness another significant moment. Even the background noise of the terminal seemed to fade as passengers strained to hear what Sarah would say next. "Military personnel don't have government job security," Sarah continued. "We have the privilege of risking our lives in service to our country, often for pay that's less than what your junior executives make. We don't get to work from comfortable offices or conduct our business in air-conditioned conference rooms. We work in deserts and mountains and jungles, in places where the wrong decision doesn't cost money, it costs lives." Morrison's face was starting to show the first signs of uncertainty, but he maintained his aggressive posture. "That's all very admirable, Commander. But it doesn't change the fact that we have legitimate business needs that could be accommodated with a simple gesture of courtesy on your part." "You want to talk about courtesy?" Sarah's voice rose slightly for the first time, though it remained well within acceptable limits. "Let me tell you about the courtesy your employees showed me. They called me a minimum wage nobody. They said I was a pathetic person who had never accomplished anything meaningful. They assumed I was living in my parents' basement and suggested I had never held a real job." The crowd was murmuring now, with many passengers expressing audible disapproval of the executive's behavior. Morrison glanced around nervously, clearly realizing that public opinion was not on his side, but he seemed committed to his course of action. "People say things when they're frustrated," Morrison said dismissively. "I'm sure no real offense was intended. The important thing now is finding a solution that works for everyone." "The solution is simple," Sarah replied. "Your employees apologize sincerely for their behavior, and you find somewhere else to conduct your business. I'm not moving from this seat." Morrison's face flushed red. "Commander, I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. Morrison Financial manages over $2 billion in assets. We have connections throughout the financial industry, and our work affects thousands of jobs across multiple industries. I've met with senators, cabinet members, and foreign dignitaries. I don't think a junior military officer is in a position to dictate terms to me." The crowd's reaction was immediate and negative. Several passengers could be heard expressing disgust at Morrison's arrogance, and a few people actually booed. But Morrison seemed oblivious to the hostile reception his words were receiving from the watching crowd. "Junior military officer?" Sarah repeated, her eyebrows rising slightly. "Mr. Morrison, do you know what it takes to become a Navy SEAL?" Morrison waved his hand dismissively. "I'm sure it's very difficult, But, no, Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through his dismissal like a blade. You clearly don't understand, so let me educate you. The Navy SEAL training program has a failure rate of over 80%. Men who are Olympic-level athletes wash out. Men who are Harvard graduates wash out. Men who think they're the toughest people on earth discover they're not tough enough. The terminal had gone quiet again, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that Morrison had finally pushed too far and was about to face consequences he hadn't anticipated. I survived that training, Sarah continued, her voice gaining intensity without losing control. But that was just the beginning. I then spent years proving myself in combat situations that would break most people mentally and physically. I've led teams into situations where the margin for error was zero, where one mistake would mean the death of American servicemen and the failure of critical missions. Morrison opened his mouth to interrupt, but something in Sarah's expression made him think better of it. I've been shot at by enemy snipers, targeted by improvised explosive devices, and hunted by terrorist cells that would love nothing more than to capture or kill an American SEAL team leader. I've made split-second decisions while under fire that saved the lives of my teammates and accomplished objectives that kept this country safer. Sarah's voice was now carrying throughout the terminal. And you think managing a financial portfolio qualifies you to lecture me about real-world pressure and responsibility? The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Passengers who had been quietly watching were now openly cheering Sarah's response, and several people could be heard calling Morrison and his employees various unflattering names. The CEO looked around in obvious shock, clearly unprepared for such a hostile reception. But Morrison wasn't finished. Perhaps driven by embarrassment or a desperate need to save face, he decided to double down on his position. That's all very impressive, Commander, but combat experience doesn't necessarily translate to an understanding of complex business realities. Military thinking tends to be rather simplistic, black and white. In the business world, we deal with nuances and subtleties that require more sophisticated analysis. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Passengers were now openly booing Morrison, and several people were shouting angry responses to his continued insults. Airport security was moving closer, clearly preparing to intervene before the situation got completely out of hand. Sarah stood perfectly still for a long moment, studying Morrison's face with an intensity that made him visibly uncomfortable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried easily through the now-silent terminal. Mr. Morrison, let me give you an example of military decision-making, and you can judge for yourself whether it's too simplistic for your sophisticated business mind. She paused, making sure she had everyone's complete attention. 3 years ago, I led a team into a compound in Afghanistan where intelligence indicated we would find a high-value terrorist target. When we arrived, we discovered that the target was using a school full of children as his headquarters, with over 60 kids being held as human shields. The terminal was completely silent now. Even Morrison seemed transfixed by what he was hearing. We had multiple objectives that night: capture or kill the target, rescue any hostages, and gather intelligence about planned terrorist attacks. But we also had to ensure zero civilian casualties, operate in complete stealth to avoid alerting other terrorist cells in the area, and complete the mission before dawn when the political situation would become impossible. Sarah began walking slowly around Morrison as she spoke, though her eyes never left his face. In the span of 15 minutes, I had to coordinate with drone operators, intelligence analysts, and local military forces. I had to calculate wind speed and direction for sniper shots, analyze building schematics I'd never seen before, and develop contingency plans for 7 different scenarios that could have resulted in mission failure or the deaths of my teammates. Morrison was beginning to look genuinely uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot as Sarah continued her methodical explanation. I had to make decisions about which children to evacuate first, which walls could be breached without compromising the building's structural integrity, and how to neutralize armed terrorists in close proximity to innocent civilians. Every choice I made had to account for variables including local police response times, potential media coverage, diplomatic implications, and the psychological trauma to the children involved. The crowd was hanging on every word. Several people were openly emotional, and a few passengers could be seen wiping away tears as they listened to Sarah's account. The mission lasted 4 hours. We successfully rescued all 63 children without a single civilian casualty. We captured the terrorist target alive along with intelligence that prevented 2 planned attacks on American military bases. And we accomplished all of this while operating in a foreign country, in the dark, with limited backup and no possibility of rapid evacuation if things went wrong. Sarah stopped walking and faced Morrison directly. Now, Mr. Morrison, tell me about the nuances and subtleties of your sophisticated business analysis. Explain to me how managing a financial portfolio compares to making life and death decisions for dozens of innocent children while under enemy fire. Help me understand how your conference call with Tokyo represents the kind of complex responsibility that my simplistic military thinking couldn't possibly comprehend. The silence stretched on for nearly a minute. Morrison stood there, his face cycling through various shades of red and white, clearly struggling to find any response that wouldn't make his earlier comments seem even more ridiculous than they already were. Finally, Jennifer stepped forward from behind her boss. Commander Martinez, I want to apologize. Not just for what I said earlier, but for all of this. You didn't deserve any of this treatment, and I'm ashamed of how we've acted. One of the male executives nodded emphatically. She's right. We were completely out of line, and there's no excuse for our behavior. Thank you for your service, and we're sorry for disrespecting you. But Morrison remained silent, his jaw clenched, and his eyes showing an hour had passed since Morrison and his team had retreated in defeat, and the terminal had finally returned to a relatively normal atmosphere. Sarah had managed to read several chapters of her book when she noticed a commotion near the information desk about 50 yards away. Raised voices carried across the space, and she could see a small crowd gathering around what appeared to be another confrontation. Initially, Sarah tried to ignore the disturbance and continue reading. She had already been involved in enough drama for one evening, and her flight would finally begin boarding in less than an hour. But as the voices grew louder and more agitated, she found it impossible to concentrate on her book. Standing up to get a better view, Sarah could see that the crowd was centered around a young man in military dress blues who appeared to be traveling alone. Even from a distance, she could tell he was upset about something, and the people surrounding him didn't seem to be offering comfort or assistance. Instead, their body language suggested they were part of the problem. Sarah's military instincts kicked in immediately. A serviceman in distress was automatically her responsibility, regardless of branch or rank. She closed her book, gathered her small bag, and began walking toward the disturbance. As she got closer, she could hear fragments of the conversation that was taking place. The young soldier, she could now see he was Army, probably early 20s, with the nervous demeanor of someone who hadn't been in service very long, was trying to explain something to a gate agent while several passengers stood around making increasingly hostile comments. I understand you have your procedures, ma'am, the soldier was saying, his voice tight with stress and frustration, but this is a family emergency. My father is in the hospital, and they don't know if he's going to make it through the night. I need to get on that flight to Denver. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with a pinched expression, was clearly unsympathetic to his situation. Sir, as I've explained multiple times, your ticket is for standby only. This flight is completely sold out, and there are 17 people ahead of you on the standby list. The next available flight isn't until tomorrow afternoon. But I explained when I bought the ticket that this was an emergency, the soldier replied, his voice cracking slightly. The person who sold it to me said there was a good chance I'd get on the flight if I got here early. A man in an expensive suit who had been listening to the conversation stepped forward with an expression of annoyance. Look, kid, we all have places we need to be. Some of us have been waiting for hours because of this delay, and we're not about to give up our seats so you can get a free ride on the Sympathy Express. Several other passengers murmured agreement, and Sarah could hear comments like, everyone has sob stories, and the military doesn't entitle you to special treatment. The soldier's face flushed red with embarrassment and what Sarah recognized as barely controlled emotion. I'm not asking for special treatment, the young man said, his voice becoming defensive. I just need to get home to see my father before. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Before what? Asked a woman in designer clothes, her tone dripping with skepticism. Before you miss out on your free vacation? Do you really expect us to believe this convenient family emergency that just happened to occur right when you needed to travel? Sarah had heard enough. She approached the group with the kind of purposeful stride that had been developed over years of taking command in difficult situations. The crowd parted automatically as she approached, though they didn't immediately recognize her as the same person who had been involved in the earlier confrontation with Morrison's executives. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice carrying clear authority despite its conversational tone. "What seems to be the problem here?" The gate agent looked up with obvious relief, apparently hoping that another passenger might be able to help resolve the situation. "This gentleman is trying to get on a sold-out flight, and he doesn't seem to understand that standby means standby." Sarah looked at the young soldier, who was now standing at rigid attention despite the emotional stress he was obviously experiencing. She could see the slight tremor in his hands, and the way he was fighting to maintain his military composure in front of a crowd of hostile civilians. "What's your name, soldier?" Sarah asked gently. "Private First Class James Mitchell, ma'am," he replied, his voice steadying slightly at the familiar structure of military protocol. "At ease, Private," Sarah said with a small smile. "Tell me about your situation." The relief on Mitchell's face was immediate and profound. Here was someone who understood military culture, someone who wasn't going to assume he was lying or looking for special treatment. He relaxed slightly from his rigid posture and began explaining his circumstances. "Ma'am, I received a call this morning that my father had a heart attack. He's in intensive care in Denver, and my mother said the doctors aren't sure he's going to make it. I bought the only ticket I could afford on short notice, which was a standby ticket, and I flew standby to get here for my connecting flight." Sarah listened carefully, noting the details that confirmed the authenticity of his story. His uniform was impeccable despite obvious signs of hasty travel. His military ID was visible in his wallet, and she could see boarding passes from his earlier flights. Most importantly, his emotional state was consistent with someone facing a genuine family crisis. "I understand you need to get to Denver urgently," Sarah said. "What's your father's condition?" Mitchell's composure finally began to crack as he answered. "They said he had a massive heart attack. He's been in surgery for 6 hours, and even if he survives the operation, they don't know if there's going to be any brain damage from the time he was down. My mother is there alone, and she's—" His voice broke completely. The man in the expensive suit rolled his eyes dramatically. "Oh, please. This is exactly the kind of manipulation I was talking about. Turn on the waterworks, and suddenly, everyone's supposed to feel sorry for you." Several other passengers nodded in agreement, and Sarah could hear additional skeptical comments from the crowd. But she was watching Mitchell's face carefully, and she had no doubt that his distress was genuine. She had seen enough real grief and authentic fear to recognize it when she encountered it. "Private Mitchell," Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone she used when addressing troops under her command, "I want you to know that I believe you, and I'm going to help you get home to your family." The change in Mitchell's expression was dramatic. Hope flickered in his eyes for the first time since Sarah had approached, though he clearly didn't understand how this civilian woman could possibly help with his situation. Sarah turned to address the gate agent. "Ma'am, I have a confirmed seat on this flight to Denver. I'd like to give that seat to Private Mitchell." The agent looked surprised but pleased, clearly relieved to have a potential solution to the problem that had been escalating for the past 30 minutes. "That's very generous of you. But I'll need to check on the airline's policies regarding ticket transfers." "It's not a transfer," Sarah clarified. "I'm voluntarily giving up my seat. Private Mitchell can have my confirmed reservation, and I'll take his standby position." The expensive suit man stepped forward aggressively. "Now wait just a minute. If there are seats available, they should go to paying customers who have been waiting, not to some kid with a sob story." Sarah turned to face him with a level stare that made him unconsciously step backward. "Sir, this is between me and the airline. I'm voluntarily relinquishing my seat to someone who needs it more than I do." "This is ridiculous," the designer clothes woman interjected. "We're all paying customers with legitimate travel needs. The military doesn't get to jump to the front of the line just because they wear a uniform." "You're absolutely right," Sarah agreed calmly. The military doesn't get special treatment. But basic human compassion should mean something. This young man is trying to get home to see his dying father. I'm traveling for personal reasons that can wait another day. It's a simple matter of priorities. The crowd was growing larger again, but this time the audience seemed more divided. Some passengers were clearly moved by Mitchell's situation and supportive of Sarah's gesture, while others appeared to agree with the critics who felt that emotional appeals shouldn't override normal procedures. A businessman who had been watching quietly stepped forward. I think what you're doing is admirable, ma'am, but these people have a point. If we start making exceptions based on personal sob stories, where does it end? Everyone will claim they have an emergency. Sarah considered his argument seriously before responding. You're right that policies exist for good reasons. But policies should serve people, not the other way around. When we have an opportunity to help someone in genuine need without harming anyone else, I believe we should take it. But you are harming someone else, the expensive suit man insisted. You're harming everyone who's been waiting legitimately for standby seats. There are procedures for a reason, and this kid needs to follow them like everyone else. Mitchell, who had been listening to the debate about his situation with obvious discomfort, finally spoke up. Ma'am, I appreciate your offer more than I can say, but I don't want to cause any more problems. Maybe I should just wait for the next flight. The desperation in his voice was heartbreaking, and Sarah could see that he was on the verge of giving up entirely. She also recognized the military training that was making him reluctant to accept help that might inconvenience others, even when he desperately needed that help. Private, Sarah said firmly, you're not causing problems. You're dealing with a family crisis, and you deserve support, not criticism. She turned back to the crowd. I'm amazed that some of you are more concerned with airline procedures than with helping a young man see his dying father. It's not about procedures, the designer woman insisted. It's about fairness. Why should he get special treatment just because he has a sad story? We all have responsibilities and people depending on us. Sarah's patience was beginning to wear thin, but she maintained her composure. Ma'am, if your father was dying in a hospital, and someone offered to help you get there faster, would you turn down that help because it might not be fair to other passengers? The woman hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the direct question. That's different. I would have planned better and bought a confirmed ticket. Private Mitchell did buy a ticket, Sarah replied. He bought what he could afford on short notice. Not everyone has unlimited travel budgets. The expensive suit man laughed harshly. Oh, please. The military takes care of its own. They get all kinds of benefits and special deals. He could have gotten emergency leave travel if this was really an emergency. Mitchell's face flushed again, and Sarah could see his anger rising. But before he could respond, she stepped forward to address the man directly. Sir, you clearly don't understand how military emergency leave works. The process can take hours or even days, depending on command structure and paperwork requirements. When someone gets a call that their parent is dying, they don't have time to navigate bureaucracy. They need to get home immediately. So they expect the rest of us to accommodate their poor planning? The woman asked. Sarah's expression hardened noticeably. Their poor planning? Private Mitchell received word this morning that his father had a heart attack. He immediately began trying to get home to his family. Exactly what part of that sequence represents poor planning on his part? The crowd was murmuring now, with more passengers beginning to voice support for Mitchell's situation. Several people were expressing disgust with the critics, and Sarah could hear comments about the lack of compassion being shown to a young soldier dealing with a family crisis. An elderly woman pushed forward through the crowd, her voice trembling with emotion. I lost my husband in Vietnam, and I remember what it was like when soldiers couldn't get home for family emergencies. This young man is willing to sacrifice his life for our country. The least we can do is show him some kindness when he needs it most. Her words seemed to shift the mood of the crowd significantly. More passengers began speaking up in support of Sarah's gesture, and the critics found themselves increasingly outnumbered. But the expensive suit man wasn't ready to concede defeat. This is all very touching, he said sarcastically, but we still have a fundamental fairness issue here. If this woman wants to give up her seat, that's her choice. But the seat should go to the next person on the standby list, not to someone who's trying to skip ahead based on an emotional appeal. Sarah turned to face him with an expression that had intimidated enemy combatants in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Sir, I'm beginning to wonder what kind of person argues against helping a young soldier see his dying father. Are you really that concerned about airline fairness? Or are you just looking for an excuse to be cruel to someone who can't fight back? The directness of her challenge seemed to surprise him. I'm not being cruel. I'm being practical. We can't run society based on emotional manipulation. Emotional manipulation? Sarah's voice rose slightly, and, for the first time, some of her military bearing became visible to the crowd. A young man's father is dying. And you think his distress is manipulation? The businessman who had spoken earlier tried to intervene. Look, everyone calm down. This is getting out of hand. Maybe we can find a compromise here. But Sarah's attention remained focused on the man in the expensive suit. She had dealt with his type before. People who used concepts like fairness and procedures to justify their lack of basic human compassion. In her experience, such people needed to be confronted directly before they would back down. Sir, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Do you believe that Private Mitchell should have to wait until tomorrow to find out if his father survived the night? The man opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah continued before he could speak. Because that's what you're arguing for. You're arguing that airline procedures are more important than this young man's relationship with his dying father. You're arguing that your convenience matters more than his family crisis. The crowd had gone quiet again, waiting to see how the man would respond to such a direct challenge. He looked around nervously, clearly realizing that public opinion had shifted decisively against him, but still unwilling to back down completely. I'm arguing for consistent policies, he said finally. If we make exceptions for everyone with a sad story, the whole system breaks down. Sarah nodded slowly. I see. And when was the last time you served your country in uniform? When was the last time you put your life on the line so that others could live in freedom? The man's face reddened. That's irrelevant. Military service doesn't entitle anyone to special treatment in civilian life. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. Military service doesn't entitle anyone to special treatment. But basic human decency should entitle everyone to compassion when they're facing a family crisis. She turned to address the entire crowd. I'm not asking anyone else to give up their seat. I'm not suggesting that the airline change its policies. I'm simply offering to help a fellow human being in need. And I'm being told that this gesture threatens the foundations of civilized society. The elderly woman who had spoken about losing her husband in Vietnam stepped forward again. Honey, you do what your heart tells you to do. Some people have forgotten what it means to care about others. Several other passengers voiced agreement, and the tide of public opinion seemed to turn decisively in favor of Sarah's gesture. The gate agent, who had been watching the entire exchange with obvious discomfort, finally spoke up. Ma'am, if you want to voluntarily give up your seat, I can process that change immediately. Private Mitchell, I'll need to see your ID and standby confirmation. As Mitchell moved forward with his documents, clearly overcome with gratitude, the expensive suit man made one final attempt to assert his position. This sets a terrible precedent, he declared loudly. Mark my words, everyone will be claiming family emergencies if they think it will get them better treatment. Sarah turned back to him with a look that made several nearby passengers take an involuntary step backward. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly throughout the terminal area. Sir, if you're ever in a situation where your parent is dying and you need help getting home, I hope someone shows you more compassion than you've shown this young soldier today. With that, she turned away from him and approached Mitchell, who was completing his paperwork with the gate agent. The young soldier looked up at her with tears in his eyes. Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you. I don't even know your name. Sarah smiled warmly for the first time since the confrontation had begun. Commander Sarah Martinez, United States Navy. And you don't need to thank me, Private. Just get home to your family. The revelation of her identity caused another stir among the crowd, particularly among those who had witnessed her earlier confrontation with Morrison's executives. But Sarah was focused entirely on Mitchell, who was staring at her with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Commander, you've given me the chance to see my father one more time. I'll never forget this. Your father is going to be fine, Sarah said with quiet confidence. And 2 hours later, Sarah finally boarded her rescheduled flight to Denver as a standby passenger. The plane was nearly empty due to the late hour and the multiple delays that had plagued the route throughout the evening. As she settled into her window seat, she felt a sense of satisfaction about her decision to help Private Mitchell, even though it meant arriving at her destination a full day later than planned. The flight attendant, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a genuine smile, stopped by Sarah's seat during the pre-flight safety check. "Excuse me, but aren't you the woman who gave up her seat for that young soldier?" Sarah nodded, slightly surprised that word had spread to the flight crew. "Yes, that was me. I just wanted to thank you," the attendant said quietly. "I've been working these routes for 15 years, and I've seen too many situations where people could have helped each other, but chose not to. What you did tonight was special." As the plane took off, Sarah reflected on the evening's events. 3 separate confrontations, each revealing something different about human nature and the way people respond to challenges to their comfort or assumptions. She had encountered cruelty, arrogance, and selfishness, but she had also witnessed compassion, gratitude, and decency from unexpected sources. The flight was smooth and quiet, giving Sarah the peaceful reading time she had been seeking all evening. But about an hour into the flight, her solitude was interrupted by a commotion from the front of the cabin. Raised voices and the sound of rapid movement caused her to look up from her book to see what was happening. A man in his 30s was standing in the aisle near the front of the plane, gesticulating wildly and speaking in an agitated tone to one of the flight attendants. Even from her seat toward the back of the aircraft, Sarah could tell that he was intoxicated and becoming increasingly belligerent. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat and lower your voice," the flight attendant was saying, her professional demeanor barely concealing her growing concern. "You're disturbing other passengers." "Don't tell me what to do," the man shouted, his voice carrying clearly through the nearly empty cabin. "I paid for this ticket, and I'll stand wherever I want to stand. This is America, and I have rights." Sarah could see that the few other passengers on the plane were becoming nervous. An elderly couple several rows ahead of her were huddled together, clearly frightened by the man's aggressive behavior. A businessman across the aisle was on his phone, presumably alerting someone on the ground about the developing situation. The intoxicated passenger was now pointing an accusing finger at the flight attendant, his movements becoming more erratic and threatening. "You people think you can push everyone around just because you wear a uniform. Well, I'm not going to take it anymore." Sarah's military training automatically kicked in as she assessed the situation. The man was clearly drunk, possibly on drugs, and his behavior was escalating rapidly. The flight crew was trying to handle the situation professionally, but they were not equipped to deal with someone who might become physically violent. Standing up quietly, Sarah began moving toward the front of the cabin, staying in the aisle but keeping enough distance to avoid immediately provoking the agitated passenger. She wanted to be close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid making the situation worse by adding another person to the confrontation. "Sir," the flight attendant was saying, her voice remaining remarkably calm despite the obvious stress of the situation, "I understand you're upset, but federal law requires all passengers to follow crew instructions. If you don't return to your seat, we'll have to report this incident to the authorities." "Authorities?" The man laughed harshly. "You think I'm scared of the authorities? I've dealt with bigger problems than some airplane rent-a-cop." He took a step closer to the flight attendant, his posture becoming more aggressive and threatening. Sarah moved closer, now only about 6 rows away from the confrontation. She could see that the man was probably in his mid-30s, well-dressed but disheveled, with the flushed complexion and unsteady movements of someone who had been drinking heavily. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, and his speech was slurred enough to suggest significant intoxication. "Look, lady," the man continued, his voice rising again. "I've had a really bad day, okay? My business is falling apart, my wife left me, and now I'm stuck on this cheap airline with people who think they can boss me around. So why don't you just back off and let me drink my beer in peace?" The flight attendant glanced around nervously, clearly looking for support from her colleagues or hoping to spot an air marshal among the passengers. But the plane was too small and too lightly staffed to have significant security presence, and her fellow crew members were busy trying to contact ground control about the developing situation. "Sir, alcohol consumption is prohibited during flight disturbances," the attendant explained patiently. "I need you to give me the beer and return to your seat immediately, or we'll have to divert this flight to the nearest airport." Divert the flight? The man's voice became even louder and more threatening. "You'll do no such thing. I have important business in Denver, and you're not going to screw that up for me too." He reached into his jacket pocket, and several passengers gasped audibly. Sarah immediately moved into action, closing the distance between herself and the agitated man with the fluid, purposeful movement of someone trained for exactly these kinds of situations. "Excuse me," Sarah said calmly, appearing suddenly at the man's elbow before he could fully process her approach. "Is there something I can help you with?" The man spun around to face her, his hand still in his jacket pocket, his expression shifting from anger to confusion as he tried to focus on this new person who had appeared beside him. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, swaying slightly as he turned. "This is none of your business, lady. Go back to your seat and mind your own business." Sarah remained perfectly calm, positioning herself between the man and the flight attendant while maintaining a non-threatening posture. "My name is Sarah, and I couldn't help but notice that you seem upset about something. Maybe we can talk about it." "Talk about it?" The man laughed bitterly. "You want to talk about how my entire life is falling apart? About how everyone I trusted has betrayed me? About how I'm losing everything I worked for?" His voice cracked slightly, and Sarah realized that beneath the anger and aggression was someone who was genuinely in pain. The alcohol had lowered his inhibitions and amplified his emotions, but the underlying distress was real and profound. "That sounds incredibly difficult," Sarah said with genuine sympathy. "It must be really hard to deal with all of that at once." The man stared at her suspiciously, clearly not having expected compassion from a stranger who had inserted herself into his confrontation with the airline crew. "Yeah, well, life's hard. Most people don't give a damn about anyone else's problems." "You're right about that," Sarah agreed. "But sometimes talking to someone can help, even if they're a stranger. What kind of business are you in?" The man's hand slowly came out of his jacket pocket, revealing nothing more threatening than a crumpled tissue. The tension in the cabin decreased noticeably as passengers realized there was no immediate physical threat. "Construction," the man said, his voice losing some of its aggressive edge. "Had my own company for 10 years. Built it up from nothing, employed 30 people, was making good money." His expression grew bitter again. "Then, my business partner cleaned out our accounts and disappeared with our biggest client. Left me with nothing but debt and lawsuits." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "That's a terrible betrayal. Someone you trusted stole your life's work." "Damn right he did," the man said, his anger returning but now directed at his absent business partner rather than the flight crew. 20 years of friendship, and he screwed me over for money. And then, my wife decides she doesn't want to be married to a broke construction worker, so she files for divorce and tries to take what little I have left." The flight attendant was watching the exchange with obvious relief, grateful that Sarah had managed to defuse the immediate confrontation. Other passengers were also relaxing as it became clear that the situation was being resolved peacefully. "So you've lost your business and your marriage at the same time," Sarah summarized. "That would be devastating for anyone. I can understand why you'd want to have a few drinks to cope with that kind of stress." "Exactly," the man said, nodding emphatically. "I'm not some kind of troublemaker. I'm just trying to get through the worst time of my life, and everyone keeps telling me what I can and can't do." Sarah could see that he was beginning to calm down as he talked about his situation. The combination of being heard without judgment and having someone acknowledge the legitimacy of his pain was helping to defuse his aggressive energy. "What's your name?" Sarah asked. "Mike," the man replied. "Mike Patterson." "Mike, I'm going to be honest with you," Sarah said gently. "I understand why you're upset, and I'm sorry about everything that's happened to you. But right now, you're scaring the other passengers, and you're putting the flight crew in an impossible position." Mike looked around the cabin as if noticing the other passengers for the first time. He could see the elderly couple still huddled together fearfully, and a woman traveling alone who was clutching her purse tightly. His expression showed the first signs of shame and regret. "I didn't mean to scare anyone," he said quietly. I'm so angry all the time now. I don't know how to handle what's happening to me." "Anger is a normal response to what you've been through," Sarah assured him. "But taking it out on innocent people isn't going to help you feel better, and it's going to create new problems for you." Mike nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging as the adrenaline and anger began to drain away. "You're right. I'm acting like an idiot. I just don't know what to do anymore." Sarah could see that he was on the verge of an emotional breakdown. The alcohol had amplified his feelings, but it had also made him more vulnerable and open to connection with others. She recognized this as a critical moment where her response could either help him find some stability or push him deeper into despair. "Mike, can I tell you something that might help?" Sarah asked. He nodded, looking at her with the desperate hope of someone who had been drowning and, suddenly, been thrown a life preserver. "I've seen a lot of people go through terrible situations, and I've learned that the strongest people aren't the ones who never face problems. The strongest people are the ones who find ways to rebuild after everything falls apart." Mike was listening intently now, his earlier aggression completely forgotten. "But how do you rebuild when you've lost everything? When people you trusted have destroyed your life?" "One day at a time," Sarah replied. "One decision at a time. You start by taking care of the basics, your health, your sobriety, your immediate needs. Then, you begin making small choices that move you in the direction you want to go." "But I don't even know what direction I want to go," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I worked for is gone." "That's actually an opportunity," Sarah said. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but when everything is stripped away, you get the chance to rebuild based on what really matters to you, not what other people expect or what you think you should want." Mike was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had said. Around them, the other passengers were watching with a mixture of curiosity and admiration as they witnessed this transformation from hostility to vulnerability. "Can I ask you something?" Mike said finally. "You're not just some random passenger, are you? You handle crisis situations like someone who's trained for it." Sarah smiled slightly. "I'm in the military. I've had experience helping people work through difficult situations." "I should have guessed," Mike said with a rueful laugh. "You have that calm authority thing that drill sergeants have. But you're not treating me like a screw-up." "Because you're not a screw-up," Sarah replied firmly. "You're a person dealing with more stress than anyone should have to handle alone. The fact that you're still standing, still trying to move forward, tells me you're stronger than you realize." Mike's eyes filled with tears, and he had to turn away for a moment to compose himself. When he looked back at Sarah, his expression was completely different from the angry, aggressive man who had been threatening the flight crew just minutes earlier. "Thank you," he said simply. "I needed someone to remind me that I'm not completely worthless." "You're far from worthless, Mike. You built a successful business from nothing, which means you have skills, determination, and leadership ability. Those qualities don't disappear just because someone else made bad choices." The flight attendant approached cautiously, clearly relieved that the situation had been resolved but still needing to address the regulatory issues that Mike's behavior had created. "Sir," she said gently, "I appreciate that you're calmer now, but I do need you to return to your seat for the remainder of the flight. And I'll need to confiscate any alcohol you might have with you." Mike nodded immediately, pulling a small bottle of whiskey from his jacket pocket and handing it to the attendant. "I'm sorry for causing problems. I was out of line, and I know you're just doing your job." "Thank you for understanding," the attendant replied with obvious relief. "And thank you," she added to Sarah, "for helping to resolve this situation." As Mike returned to his seat, Sarah prepared to go back to her own row. But Mike turned back to her one more time. "Can I ask you one more question?" he said. "How do you know when it's worth trying to rebuild versus when it's time to just give up?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "In my experience, it's worth trying as long as you still care about something or someone. As long as there's something in your life that matters to you, there's a reason to keep going." "I have a daughter," Mike said quietly. "She's 8 years old, and she still thinks I'm a hero, even though her mother tells her I'm a failure. I want to be the kind of man she can be proud of." "Then, you have your answer," Sarah replied with a warm smile. "Everything else can be rebuilt, but your daughter only gets one father." Be the man she already believes you are. As Mike settled into his seat, and Sarah returned to her book, the cabin returned to its earlier peaceful state. But the atmosphere was different now, charged with the kind of positive energy that comes from witnessing genuine human connection and redemption. The flight attendant stopped by Sarah's seat one more time before landing. "That was incredible," she said quietly. "In 15 years of flying, I've never seen someone defuse a situation like that. How did you know exactly what to say to him?" Sarah looked up from her book. "I didn't know what to say. I just listened to what he really needed, which wasn't someone to fight with. It was someone to remind him that he still had value as a human being. Well, whatever you did, you probably saved us from having to divert the flight and having him arrested. You gave him a chance to save face and start over." As the plane descended toward Denver, Sarah reflected on the evening's events. She had encountered people at their worst and at their best, sometimes within the same individual. The experience had reminded her that beneath most aggressive behavior was pain, fear, or desperation, and that addressing those underlying needs was often more effective than confronting the surface behavior. When the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, Mike approached Sarah one more time. He looked sober and composed, though still clearly dealing with significant emotional stress. "I wanted to give you this," he said, handing her a business card from his construction company. "I know the business is gone, but that's my personal cell phone number on the back. If you ever need anything, carpentry work, moving help, whatever, please call me. I want to find some way to pay back what you did for me tonight." Sarah accepted the card graciously. "Mike, you don't owe me anything. Just take care of yourself and be there for your daughter." "I will," Mike promised. "And I'm going to remember what you said about rebuilding based on what really matters. I think maybe losing everything was the wake-up call I needed." 6 months later, Sarah was back in the same airport terminal, waiting for another delayed flight. This time, however, she was traveling in her dress blue uniform, having just completed a ceremony at the Pentagon where she had received a commendation for her service in a recent classified operation. The formal military attire drew respectful nods and comments from fellow travelers, a stark contrast to the invisibility she had enjoyed during her previous visit to this terminal. As she settled into a seat near the same gate where her earlier adventures had unfolded, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the memories of that eventful evening. The interactions with Jennifer Walsh and her executives, the confrontation with Richard Morrison, the situation with Private Mitchell, and the incident with Mike Patterson on the plane had all taught her valuable lessons about human nature and the power of compassion in difficult circumstances. Lost in her thoughts, Sarah almost didn't notice when a familiar voice called her name from across the terminal. Looking up, she was surprised to see Private Mitchell approaching her, though he was now wearing the uniform of a specialist and carrying himself with notably more confidence than he had displayed during their first encounter. "Commander Martinez," Mitchell called out with genuine excitement. "I can't believe it's really you." Sarah stood and returned his enthusiastic salute with a warm smile. "Specialist Mitchell, you look like you're doing well. How's your father?" Mitchell's face lit up with joy. "He made a full recovery, ma'am. The doctors said it was touch and go for a while, but he pulled through without any lasting damage. He's back at work and feeling better than he has in years." "I'm so glad to hear that," Sarah replied with genuine warmth. "And I see you've been promoted. Congratulations." "Thank you, ma'am. I'm actually on my way to Fort Carson for advanced training. I decided to make the Army my career, and I'm hoping to eventually qualify for Special Forces." Mitchell's expression grew serious. "That night when you helped me get home, it changed everything for me. Seeing how you handled yourself, the way you stood up for what was right without backing down, it inspired me to push myself harder and aim higher." Before Sarah could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Commander Martinez? I thought that was you." Sarah turned to see Mike Patterson approaching, looking dramatically different from the disheveled, intoxicated man she had encountered on the plane 6 months earlier. He was clean-shaven, well-dressed in business casual attire, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had successfully rebuilt his life. "Mike," Sarah exclaimed with pleasant surprise. "You look fantastic. How have you been?" "Better than I have any right to be," Mike replied with a grin. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did for me that night. You probably saved my life." Specialist Mitchell looked between them curiously, clearly sensing that there was another story behind this reunion. Sarah quickly introduced the two men and explained how she had met each of them during her previous trip through this airport. You helped him too? Mitchell asked with amazement. Commander, how many people did you rescue that night? Mike laughed. She's probably too modest to tell you. But your commander here has a habit of stepping in when people need help the most. As the three of them found seats together, Mike began sharing the story of how his life had changed since that night on the plane. After our conversation, I realized I had been wallowing in self-pity instead of focusing on solutions. I took your advice about rebuilding based on what really mattered to me. Which was your daughter? Sarah remembered. Exactly. I got sober, found a good counselor to help me deal with my anger and depression, and started looking for ways to rebuild my career. It wasn't easy, but I kept thinking about what you said about being the man my daughter already believed I was. Mitchell leaned forward with interest. What happened with your business? Well, the original company was gone, but I had 20 years of experience and a lot of good relationships in the construction industry. I started over as a subcontractor, working for other companies until I could save enough money to start my own business again. Mike's pride in his accomplishment was evident. It took 6 months of 18-hour days and living in a studio apartment, but I managed to launch Patterson Construction 2.0. That's incredible, Sarah said with genuine admiration. How are things going now? Better than I ever expected. I'm specializing in affordable housing projects, working with nonprofits and community organizations to build homes for low-income families. It's less profitable than my old commercial work, but it's more meaningful. I go to sleep every night knowing I'm helping families have a better life. Mitchell nodded approvingly. And your daughter? How did she react to all the changes? Mike's expression softened. She's been amazing. The divorce was hard on her, but she's adjusted well. My ex-wife has actually been more supportive since I got my life back on track. We're not getting back together, but we're co-parenting effectively now, and my daughter knows she has two parents who love as Sarah finally left the plane and entered the Denver airport terminal. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with reaching her destination. 3 times during this journey, she had been given the opportunity to help fellow human beings who were struggling with pain, fear, or desperation. Each situation had been different, but all had required the same basic response: listening without judgment and offering compassion without expecting anything in return. The terminal was nearly empty at the late hour, and Sarah moved quickly toward the baggage claim area where her luggage would eventually arrive. As she walked through the quiet corridors, she thought about Private Mitchell, who was probably at his father's bedside by now, and about Mike Patterson, who was beginning the difficult process of rebuilding his life around what truly mattered to him. Her own travel plans had been disrupted, her evening had been more complicated than expected, and she was arriving at her destination exhausted after a series of stressful confrontations. But she wouldn't trade the experience for anything. Sometimes the most meaningful journeys were the ones that took you somewhere completely different from where you had planned to go. And he recovers. You tell him that his son serves with honor. That will mean more to him than you realize. As Mitchell gathered his belongings and prepared to board the flight that would take him home to his family, Sarah returned to her original seat to wait for standby boarding. The expensive suit man and his supporters had melted away into the crowd, no longer willing to continue their argument in the face of overwhelming public disapproval. The elderly veteran who had approached her earlier returned once more. Commander, what you did for that young man. That's what America is supposed to be about. Sarah settled back into her chair and reopened her book, though she found herself thinking about Mitchell's situation rather than the words on the page. In a few hours, he would be at his father's bedside, holding his hand and letting him know that his son had made it home. That simple human connection was worth far more than any airline policy or procedural concern. As boarding began for the Denver flight, Sarah watched Mitchell disappear down the jetway, carrying with him the hope of reconciliation and the comfort of family in a time of crisis. It was a small victory, but, in Sarah's experience, the most important battles were often fought on the smallest stages, a mixture of anger and humiliation. The crowd was watching him expectantly, waiting for some acknowledgement of what had just transpired. some recognition of the profound error in judgment he had displayed. Instead, Morrison turned on his heel and walked away without another word, leaving his employees standing awkwardly in front of Sarah and the assembled crowd of passengers. Jennifer and the two executives offered additional apologies before hurrying after their boss, clearly uncertain about their professional futures after the public relations disaster they had just witnessed. As the executives disappeared into the crowd, the passengers began to disperse once again, but many stopped to speak with Sarah personally. The elderly veteran returned to thank her again for her service. A young mother approached to tell her that her story had given her a new appreciation for the sacrifices military families make. A businessman who had been quietly watching the entire confrontation handed her his business card and offered to help her with anything she might need. Sarah accepted the thanks and compliments graciously, but she was clearly ready for the attention to die down. She returned to her seat and reopened her book, hoping to finally get some quiet reading time before her flight boarded. But as she tried to focus on the words on the page, her mind kept returning to the confrontation with Morrison. She had dealt with enemy combatants who were more respectful than these business executives. She had been in firefights that were less emotionally draining than this airport encounter. The irony wasn't lost on her that in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, surrounded by people who wanted to kill her, she had been treated with more dignity than she had received today from her fellow Americans in a civilian airport. It was a sobering reminder that the freedoms she fought to protect were sometimes used by people who had no understanding of their true cost. From all, Sarah reflected on the encounter. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her based on her appearance, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. In her line of work, the ability to blend in and appear unremarkable was often an asset rather than a liability. She thought about the irony of the situation. These executives had assumed she was powerless and insignificant, when in reality, she held one of the most demanding and respected positions in the military. They had tried to use their corporate status and financial success as weapons to intimidate her, not knowing they were facing someone who had literally been trained to remain calm under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The delayed flight announcement came over the intercom again, reminding passengers that boarding would begin in approximately 2 hours. Sarah settled back into her chair, grateful once again for the quiet time to read. Around her, the normal bustle of airport activity resumed, but she noticed that several passengers continued to glance in her direction with obvious respect and curiosity. A few seats down from her, she could see Jennifer and her colleagues huddled together, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Occasionally, one of them would glance in her direction before quickly looking away. Their important international conference call had apparently been forgotten in the aftermath of their public humiliation. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she returned to her book. The chapter she had been reading was about a character who had been underestimated by everyone around her, only to prove herself when it mattered most. Sometimes, she thought, life really did imitate art. As she read, Sarah's mind wandered to the training that had prepared her for moments like this. The military had taught her that true strength often came from restraint, that the most powerful response was often the most measured one. She could have embarrassed these people far more thoroughly if she had chosen to, but there was no honor in crushing opponents who were already defeated. The evening was still young, and her flight wouldn't board for hours. But Sarah was content to sit quietly, reading her book and reflecting on the strange encounter that had just unfolded. Tomorrow she would be back at her base, back to the serious business of training and leading some of the most elite soldiers in the world. Tonight, she was just another passenger in an airport terminal, and that was exactly how she preferred it.